are Chicago's finances worse than previously thought? The question was raised yesterday at City Hall. So what could that mean for you?
Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson has now admitted that the city's finances are completely out of whack. The budget deficit was even bigger than what was projected. And none of us should be surprised by this, because when you elect a socialist candidate to the mayorship, somebody who doesn't care about criminality, somebody who diverts resources in order to pay for illegal migrants over citizens, this is the most logical result. This is the most logical consequence, and now Brandon Johnson, in an absolute panic, is trying to figure out a way to raise taxes on the residents of the city of Chicago in order to extract more from them to try to plug this budget deficit. But in reality, there is no way forward when you pursue these kind of taxes, and this is what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money, okay?
Well, the mayor's office says they are looking for progressive revenue sources, and while those sources have yet to be identified, some groups are already expressing concern.
We have reached a point now where there's no return.
A frank admission from Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. A looming budget crisis could be even worse than expected without new taxes or cuts to city services.
The systems that people rely upon, education, healthcare, housing, our transportation, they are woefully underfunded.
So look, the city of Chicago obviously needs to cut city services. They're spending way too much money as a government, but of course, Brandon Johnson has already signaled that he's looking for progressive ways forward, as if the lengthy Democratic control of the city isn't what got them into this mess in the first place, and it's somehow going to be a solution. Now, I will also remind you that this revelation of Chicago's budget deficit being significantly worse than previously told to us by Brandon Johnson should shine a light on how corrupt this individual is, because we've covered multiple different stories of Brandon Johnson trying to borrow high interest loans against the city of Chicago's credit in order to give his constituents, his chief funders, and a union that he is a member of, the Chicago Teachers Union, a massive pay increase into perspective. This guy knew that the numbers were this bad. He knew that the math wasn't mathing, but he pretended like everything was okay, that a high interest loan would not be that big of a deal, and this is what he was doing behind the scenes while simultaneously covering up the disastrous budget that is in the city of Chicago.
I'm wondering if any of the board members can answer this question. Actually, if all of you can, just maybe even just a show of your hands. How many of you support taking out a
No, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. We're not doing that.
For a teacher's contract?
If you have a question for the mayor of Chicago, you can ask me a question. What you are not going to do is litigate what the board has the authority to do once they're appointed. You can ask that once they are appointed. No. I'm not going to do it. It's disrespectful. Do you have a question for me?
Okay, I'm sorry. You brought them up here, and it is a
Do you have a
precedent,
question for me? Ask me the question.
Okay.
Ask me if I support, I'm going to help you out.
Yeah.
Ask me the question if I believe that we should invest in our children and make sure we don't lay off brown and black women. Yes. Yes. I'm not going to tolerate cuts. That's what the issue has been in this city.
Now, Brandon Johnson had already broken a promise earlier on about not trying to raise property taxes, which is a big sticking point in the city of Chicago, when he tried to do it earlier this year, but that got voted down. So now that he has basically been obliterated by his own aldermen when it comes to property taxes, he has to find a bunch of new revenue solutions, according to him. In reality, he needs to cut spending. That's what needs to happen in order to plug this gap. But of course, when he does this, when he implements these progressive taxes, that is going to drive more and more people out of the city of Chicago, which is going to increase their need for tax revenue, because you're going to have a greater deficit because they didn't cut spending, and then they're going to pursue more progressive taxes until they've basically hollowed out their entire city.
And everyone knows that.
Right now, Chicago is facing a $1.1 billion budget gap for 2026. The financial burden could be even greater because of a pension bill signed by Governor J.B. Pritzker, which has increased retirement benefits for police and firefighters. That added over $11 billion to the city's long-term pension liability.
Yes, I'm going to put forth a package that people can assess and debate.
Now, of course, it is not just the city of Chicago. It is the Democratic governance in the state of Illinois that also creates the problem. You see, in Illinois, they essentially have a constitutional mandate that requires you to pay the pensions for government workers first. So anytime you see something signed by the governor that increase statewide benefits to these government positions, you're essentially adding in to the already stressed budgets of places like the city of Chicago in a way that they can't subvert, in a way that they can't actually answer, because if they didn't have enough money and they were already in an amazing budget deficit prior to this bill being signed, Governor Pritzker signing said bill so he could potentially run for president is going to make matters significantly worse. But again, this is a combination of horrible Democratic governance at the statewide level and, of course, horrible Democratic governance at the local level. And it's not just Brandon Johnson, but make no mistake about it, he is making it significantly worse. The answer is to cut back on expenditures, try to lower taxes, try to get more people into the city, produce more, and hopefully that will lead to the revenue increases, because in reality, Chicago is a first-rate city, at least in design. It should be drawing people there, but it is the governance of the city of Chicago that's driving people away, which is something that we see in many of our other liberal metropolitan areas across the country. There's a reason why Illinois, New York, California, and a bunch of other states are seeing declining populations while we see cities in the Sun Belt growing exponentially. And the reason for that is terrible governance, especially at the state level and at the local level. And this is the consequence of basically unbroken Democratic rule for the last 70 years in the city of Chicago.
So what could be in such a package? Johnson has already ruled out a property tax increase, which many alders had promised to vote against. Other possibilities include a corporate payroll expense tax, a head tax, and even a tax on cars coming into the downtown area, patterned after New York's congestion tax.
So each and every one of these proposals is absolutely disastrous from top to bottom. So the payroll tax, or the head tax, is quite literally a tax on employment. You are going to charge money to employers for hiring people and not expect them to downsize in order to avoid said tax. This is probably one of the worst ideas that Democratic politicians have come up with, but of course it is in vogue. It's something that they keep proposing across the country because for whatever reason, they believe that you could do absolutely anything to the business community and that will not result in a decrease in jobs. I mean, think about how insane this is. These people want to tax you for hiring people, but also make it illegal for you to not pay them what they consider to be a living wage, and they think that that is not going to result in more unemployment. It's absurd, it's insane, and again, it's the exact opposite direction they need to go to in the city of Chicago. Now, I will also point out that Brandon Johnson spent something like $10 billion or $11 billion on housing units, which are apartments, meaning that they cost $1.1 million to build, and he thought that this was worthy of celebration. And these kind of decisions, these kind of bad financial moves, are exactly what brought Chicago to this place. Rather than, making it easier for private developers to build so that the high rents can be met with increased supply, he decided to do a government job of it, spent way too much money. Again, $1.1 million for a studio apartment. That's absolutely insane. And then they wonder why they're broke. And then they propose absurd things like employment payroll taxes, a headcount tax, and of course, trying to copy New York's driving tax. However, this doesn't even have the pretense of we're trying to lower congestion. This is all about extracting revenue. So let me get this straight. Let's all try to figure this out. Brandon Johnson is in favor of a massive minimum wage increase. He says you should be basically arrested if you try to pay somebody below X amount, because that would be absolutely terrible. He also wants to tax you for having people on payroll, the headcount tax, but also in addition to that, he wants to charge drivers a fee for showing up to the downtown area of Chicago and patronizing your businesses, and he doesn't think that this is going to cause massive conflicts in the community and ultimately end up driving down tax revenue. Insane, ridiculous, but what do you expect from an idiotic socialist who's so concerned about the Confederacy being under every rock? Remember, he said when people were talking about his education spending that these were points brought up during the Confederacy.
status quo, the past mistakes that have left our students behind. We're not doing that. And then the so-called exports, the so-called fiscally responsible stewards are making the same argument when our people wanted to be liberated and emancipated in this country. The argument was, you can't free black people because it would be too expensive. They said that it would be fiscally irresponsible for this country to liberate black people. And now you have detractors making the same argument of the Confederacy when it comes to public education in this system.
Absolutely insane, ridiculous, a completely unserious candidate. And of course, there is a reason why Brandon Johnson is sitting at like an 8% approval rating.
I have not made a formal presentation yet, but I can assure you one thing, though. I am committed to making sure that the ultra-rich and those with means put more skin in the game. That is the pathway forward.
So look, we get this rhetoric about the ultra-rich having to pay more in taxes, they gotta have some skin in the game, as if we all haven't seen the charts on who's paying the majority of the taxes anywhere in this country, but especially in these major cities. And of course, that is the wealthy people. And the thing is, wealthy people also have mobility. So these people can move out to the suburbs if they still want to be near Chicago. These people can also move to the Sun Belt, to places that won't tax them, that won't punish them. So Brandon Johnson is essentially committed to killing the goose that lays the golden egg and pretending like this is good policy. And it just goes to show you that these woke progressives will commit to the destruction of society, all in the name of getting those evil riches, and it just won't work. It never works, but they still will not change course absolutely at any point ever.
Already, the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce has called some administration ideas a step backwards for economic growth.
These things are bad for business, they're bad for jobs, they're a direct disincentive for employers to hire people in Chicago.
Now look, everything this guy said is true. Again, if you tax people for hiring people, you're going to get less hiring, and that is just logical and sensible. But of course, logic and sense have never entered into the equation for the economic flat earthers that we call socialists.
Another challenge. Johnson says the Chicago public schools are owed more than $1 billion in funding from the state of Illinois.
It's $1.6 billion. These aren't my numbers. These are the state's numbers. Who's hurting ultimately here?
This I absolutely love, because Brandon Johnson has run all kinds of schemes in order to funnel money into the Chicago public school system, into the teachers union coffers, which, by the way, he happens to be a member. Rather than resign from his position, he just went on leave when he became the mayor of the city of Chicago, and he still is falling short because the city council just can't deal with this crazy spending. They can't actually handle what Brandon Johnson is proposing. But of course, Brandon Johnson is talking about how his new bill, his new idea is going to be pro-business, pro-growth, pro-worker, pro-everything, and it's going to basically sprinkle magic pixie dust over the situation and solve all of the problems.
Johnson says whatever is in the package he intends to present to the city council will be pro-business, pro-growth, and pro-worker. He is expected to make his budget address in October, but in previous years, he has pushed that back a little bit.
Okay. Does anybody believe him? Does anyone believe that Brandon Johnson is going to propose a series of tax increases that are going to be pro everyone and not have any downsides and not have any trade-offs? I mean, again, to give you an idea of how weak and terrible Brandon Johnson is, you have the mayor of Minneapolis. Again, the guy who cried at George Floyd's funeral, this weaker looking version of Justin Trudeau. He's actually seeing a renaissance in his support a little bit, and the reason why is because despite the fact that he's an absolutely cowardly, weak individual and should never be forgiven for his piss poor performance during the whole George Floyd riots fiasco, this guy actually passed a zoning reform package that made it easier to build, and guess what? Rents started stabilizing in Minneapolis, and building ended up having a boom over there. So all of the crappy things that he's done on the woke side didn't stop that broken clock from being right once a day, but Brandon Johnson has no such policy. There is nothing redeemable about this individual, and this is because he always likes to play the race card whenever he's in trouble.
Okay, so we're in still the discussion phase, the ideas phase. When does Chicago have to have a budget and have it done?
The absolute deadline is December. That's when they start worrying about the bond ratings and all of that kind of thing. So right now there's a lot of flexibility here. Once he makes that address, there'll of course be city council debate. There'll have to be an approval process.
Look, Brandon Johnson is not going to propose anything good. He's saying he's in the idea phase and whatnot, but in reality, go get them Richie Riches is not an idea at all whatsoever. It's been the policy of the Democratic Party for decades in Chicago, and that's what got them into this mess. The best thing that residents of the city of Chicago can do to actually help save their city is when you have the next primary, when you have the next mayoral race, you make sure that Brandon Johnson is a one-term mayor. Throw him out on his ass, and that is the first step to recovery, although what we saw they did after Lori Lightfoot was put in Brandon Johnson, so make no mistake about it, the residents of the city of Chicago are capable of finding a worse candidate, even if it seems unimaginable that there's a worse person to be the mayor in the city of Chicago. But of course, I want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Brandon Johnson admitting that he bankrupted the city of Chicago. Till next time.